World War I was a time of unimaginable horror. But beyond the battles and trenches lay stories that are truly unsettling. From eerie apparitions to unexplained disappearances, these are 5 chilling tales from the Great War that will leave you questioning the limits of fear and reality. It was the cold, damp night of November 1916, during the Battle of the Somme. The air hung heavy with the stench of mud, blood, and death, and the trenches were eerily quiet after a day of relentless artillery fire. A British soldier, Private Thomas Reynolds, stood at his post, peering into the darkness of no man's land. The ground between the trenches was a lifeless wasteland, riddled with craters and the twisted remains of fallen men. As the hours dragged on, Reynolds noticed something strange. Shapes, faint, ethereal figures, seemed to move silently across the battlefield. At first, he thought it might be enemy soldiers scouting the area, but there was something unnerving about them. They didn't crawl or dart between cover. They glided, almost floating, through the chaos of no man's land. Reynolds rubbed his eyes, blaming exhaustion or the tricks of the moonlight on the fog. But he wasn't the only one who saw them. A fellow soldier crouched nearby, whispered, "Do you see them too?" His voice quivered, betraying his fear. The figures became clearer as they neared. They were dressed in tattered uniforms, caked with mud and blood, their faces pale and hollow. But their eyes were dark and vacant, staring straight ahead as if searching for something, or someone. Reynolds gripped his rifle, frozen in place, unable to look away. The figures moved silently, passing between the craters and barbed wire. One stopped, turning its head toward the trench. For a fleeting moment, Reynolds felt its gaze pierce him, chilling him to the bone. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures faded into the mist. The next morning, Reynolds shared what he had seen with his commanding officer, expecting to be dismissed or mocked. But instead, he was met with a grave expression. "You're not the first to see them," the officer said quietly. "They're the ones who never made it back. The ones left behind." The story spread among the men, and soon, the ghosts of no man's land became a whispered legend in the trenches. Some believed they were the spirits of fallen comrades, lost and wandering. Others thought they were a warning, a reminder of what awaited anyone who ventured too far into that cursed land. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: no man's land was not just a battlefield. It was a graveyard, and its dead were restless. It was late 1917 during the grueling Battle of Passchendaele. The trenches were a nightmare, deep, waterlogged, and reeking of decay. The endless rain turned the battlefield into a morass of mud, swallowing soldiers and supplies alike. But the mud wasn't the worst of it. In the darkness of the trenches, another enemy lurked, one that filled even hardened soldiers with dread: the rats.
These weren't ordinary rats. They were monstrous, bloated creatures, some said to be as large as cats. They thrived on the unburied dead, feeding on the remains scattered across the battlefield. The more they ate, the bolder they became. At night, the rats ventured into the trenches, their glowing eyes piercing the blackness, their sharp teeth gnawing at anything they could sink into, including the living. Private James Moore recalled a night he would never forget. He was trying to catch a few hours of sleep in a dugout when he awoke to a sharp, searing pain in his foot. He jerked awake, fumbling for his flashlight, and what he saw made his stomach churn. A rat, its fur slick with mud and blood, was biting through his boot. Its beady eyes glinted with a feral hunger.
Moore screamed, kicking the rat away, but it barely flinched before scurrying back into the shadows. Around him, other soldiers stirred, muttering curses as they fought off the vermin. The rats were fearless, swarming over the men in waves, drawn by the scent of filth and blood. Soldiers had to sleep with their boots on and their rifles close, not to fend off the enemy, but to defend themselves from the rats.
But the horror didn't stop there. Stories spread of rats gnawing on the faces of fallen soldiers, desecrating the dead before they could be buried. Some men swore they saw the rodents dragging human remains into their dens. The thought of it haunted them, making sleep a rare and restless luxury. The rats became a symbol of the hellish conditions at Passchendaele, a relentless, creeping terror that no bullet or bayonet could stop. Some soldiers joked about forming a rat battalion to deal with the infestation, but it was gallows humor, masking their helplessness in the face of such a pervasive menace. Years later, veterans of the battle would recount the horrors of the trenches, the unending mud, the deafening artillery, the constant threat of death. But many would pause, their voices trembling as they spoke of the rats. For even amidst the chaos of war, those vile creatures had carved out a special place in their nightmares. The year was 1916, during the Battle of Verdun, a brutal, months-long ordeal that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of gunpowder and decay. The constant thunder of artillery had dulled the senses of the soldiers, leaving them in a haze of exhaustion and fear. But for some, the horror didn't just come from the enemy. It came from the voices. Deep within the labyrinth of trenches and dugouts at Verdun, French soldiers reported hearing something inexplicable. It usually happened in the dead of night, when the battlefield briefly fell silent. Men would be on watch or huddled together in restless sleep when a faint sound would drift through the air, a low murmur, just beyond the range of clarity. At first, they dismissed it as the wind whistling through the battered trenches or the creak of wooden supports. But as the nights wore on, the murmur grew more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. They were distant at first, then closer, carrying whispers in broken French, German, and sometimes languages they couldn't recognize. Corporal Henri Fournier, stationed near Fort Douaumont, recalled an unsettling encounter. One night, as he crouched in his trench, he heard someone softly calling his name. He froze, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The voice sounded like his brother's. A brother who had died at the front just weeks before. Henri called out, but no one answered. Instead, the whispers seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the trenches like a spectral choir. Others reported similar experiences. Some claimed to hear the cries of comrades long dead, begging for help or cursing their fate. Others said the voices spoke in haunting monotones, warning of doom or urging them to abandon their posts. The phenomenon became so common that it earned a grim nickname, the Verdun Ghosts. Officers tried to dismiss it as a result of shell shock, the mind cracking under the relentless stress of war. But even the hardened veterans, the men who had survived charge after charge, whispered of the voices in hushed tones. They swore they weren't imagining it. One soldier, after hearing his dead wife's voice calling to him from a nearby shell crater, was found wandering the battlefield in a daze, his rifle discarded. He claimed she had told him to leave the trench and come to her. Others were less fortunate, running into no man's land in search of the source, only to meet their deaths under enemy fire. Even after the battle, veterans of Verdun spoke of the voices with a lingering unease. Some believed they were the spirits of the dead, trapped in the battlefield, unable to move on. Others thought they were hallucinations, born of the trauma and despair of endless slaughter. But no one could explain why so many men, across so many trenches, heard the same eerie whispers in the night. The year was 1915, and the Great War was raging across Europe. On a misty August morning during the Gallipoli campaign, the men of the 1/5th Norfolk Regiment were preparing for an assault. Stationed near Suvla Bay, they were tasked with advancing on Turkish positions through rough, scrub-covered terrain. Spirits were high, but tension ran beneath their resolve as they prepared to move out. The attack began in the sweltering heat, with dust and sweat clinging to the soldiers as they marched. Ahead of them lay a ridge, partially obscured by a strange, low-hanging mist that didn't seem to dissipate, even under the blazing sun. To those observing from the rear, the mist appeared unnatural, almost luminous, hovering like a veil between the battlefield and the sky. As the Norfolk Regiment advanced, they were swallowed by the fog. Officers shouted orders. The men moved steadily forward, and then silence. The men vanished from sight. Observers later recounted the eerie scene. They had seen the regiment march into the mist, but no sounds of battle followed. No gunfire, no screams. Just an eerie quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. Hours passed, and when the fog finally lifted, the field ahead was empty. Not a single soldier from the Norfolk Regiment remained. At first, commanders believed the regiment had been captured or scattered during the advance. Search parties were sent to comb the battlefield, but they found no trace of the men. No bodies, no weapons, no gear, just the same scrubland and barren hills they had been marching toward. It was as if the regiment had been swallowed by the earth itself. Back home, rumors began to spread. Families of the missing soldiers were desperate for answers, but none came. Some whispered of supernatural forces, claiming the fog had been an omen. Others speculated about hidden ravines or sinkholes where the men might have fallen. But none of these explanations fit the facts. The sheer number of missing men, over 250, was impossible to reconcile with such theories. Years later, after the war had ended, Turkish soldiers came forward with their version of events. They claimed they had not engaged the regiment in battle, nor had they taken them prisoner. The men, they insisted, had simply disappeared. Hill 60 near Ypres was infamous during World War I, not just for the relentless battles that took place there, but for the strange and chilling stories whispered among soldiers. One tale in particular stood out. A story that sent shivers through the ranks and made even the bravest soldiers uneasy. It was a cold autumn night in 1915, and the British troops were dug in on Hill 60, an area that had changed hands multiple times during the war. The hill was scarred by artillery craters, the air thick with the smell of decay and gunpowder. Soldiers huddled in their trenches, their nerves frayed from days of bombardment. As the night grew darker, a sentry posted on the edge of the trench spotted movement in the shadows. He raised his rifle, his heart pounding, and called out the challenge. "Who goes there?" There was no reply, just the faint sound of boots crunching over the broken earth. The sentry strained his eyes and saw a figure emerging from the darkness. It was a soldier, dressed in tattered British uniform, his face pale and gaunt. The sentry lowered his rifle slightly, recognizing the insignia on the man's sleeve. "You're not supposed to be out there," the sentry said, his voice tinged with both relief and confusion. "Get back in the trench." But the figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand, as if beckoning the sentry to follow him. Then, without a word, he turned and began walking away, disappearing into the gloom. The sentry, perplexed and uneasy, hesitated before deciding to follow. He climbed out of the trench and moved cautiously toward where he'd last seen the figure. But as he stepped into the open, he suddenly froze. The air was unnaturally cold, and a strange whispering sound seemed to come from all around him. Moments later, his comrades in the trench heard a piercing scream. They rushed to investigate and found the sentry collapsed on the ground, his face contorted in terror. He was alive but incoherent, muttering about the man with no eyes who had led him into the darkness. When they carried him back to the trench and calmed him enough to speak, he told them the figure had turned around, revealing a face devoid of eyes, just dark, empty sockets that seemed to stare straight into his soul. The sentry swore he had seen other shadowy figures lurking in the distance, watching him silently before disappearing into the night. The story spread quickly among the soldiers, and Hill 60 gained a reputation as a haunted place. Some claimed the phantom was the spirit of a soldier who had been buried alive during one of the battles, doomed to wander the battlefield in search of his comrades. Others believed it was a grim warning, a harbinger of death for those stationed there.